Hey everyone! Today we're tackling something most people won't touch with a 10-foot pole. Where does Rome hide its gold? The true story of the Vatican Bank. Picture this: 74 acres of sovereign territory surrounded by Rome, 0 extradition treaties, a bank that doesn't answer to Italian regulators, and financial scandals that make Wall Street look like a lemonade stand. The Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for the Works of Religion, which is the kind of name that screams nothing to see here, has been at the center of money laundering allegations, mysterious deaths, connections to the Italian Mafia, and enough intrigue to fuel 1,000 conspiracy theories. And here's the kicker: most of it actually happened. So where does the Catholic Church actually keep its money? How did a religious institution end up running one of the world's most secretive banks? And why have multiple popes tried and failed to clean it up? The answer involves Nazi gold, Cold War espionage, a banker found hanging under a London bridge, and the kind of financial opacity that would make even Swiss bankers blush. If you think you know this story, trust me. The documented facts are stranger than any fiction, and if you're the kind of person who likes history that refuses to sanitize institutions just because they wear religious robes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we're not pulling punches. Let's start with a simple question. Why does the Pope need a bank at all? The answer takes us back to 1887, but the real story starts much earlier, with the loss of the Papal States. For over 1,000 years, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was an actual monarch who controlled a massive chunk of central Italy. We're talking about a territory that stretched from Rome to Bologna, with its own army, tax collectors, and court system. The Pope was one of the major political players in European geopolitics, throwing his weight around alongside kings and emperors. Then came Italian unification. Throughout the 1860s, the various Italian states started consolidating, and the papal territories were square in the crosshairs. In 1870, Italian forces marched into Rome, and Pope Pius IX lost his temporal kingdom. He retreated into the Vatican, declared himself a prisoner, and refused to recognize the new Italian state. For the next 59 years, there was this bizarre standoff where the Pope controlled just the Vatican complex and essentially refused to come out. No Pope set foot outside Vatican walls. They wouldn't even give blessings from the external balconies of St. Peter's Basilica. Only the internal ones. Imagine being so stubborn that you ground yourself for 6 decades. But here's the thing about losing a kingdom. You also lose the tax revenue that comes with it. The church still had massive expenses, maintaining properties across the world, funding missions, supporting clergy, running schools and hospitals. So where was the money going to come from? Donations helped, but they were unpredictable. The church needed reliable income, and more importantly, it needed to protect and grow whatever wealth it had left. Enter the Institute for the Works of Religion, founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII right in the middle of World War II, which is timing that should immediately make you raise an eyebrow. Now, officially, the bank was created to manage the Vatican's charitable works and handle the accounts of clergy, religious orders, and Vatican employees. Noble enough on paper, but the timing reveals something else. This was about financial survival and secrecy during a global conflict. The Vatican needed a way to move money around a world at war, to fund operations in occupied territories, to maintain its diplomatic corps, and to do all of this without every transaction being scrutinized by Mussolini's government or Nazi overseers. You don't announce you're starting a bank in 1942 because you want transparency. To understand what the Vatican Bank became, you need to understand what it was supposed to be, and more importantly, what it wasn't supposed to be. The Institute for the Works of Religion wasn't meant to be a commercial bank. It couldn't offer checking accounts to random Italians or mortgage loans to developers. By design, it could only serve a restricted clientele: Vatican employees, Catholic clergy, religious orders, Holy See institutions, and Catholic organizations. Think of it as a credit union for Catholics, except instead of your local teacher's credit union, it's a credit union that enjoys sovereign immunity. Here's where it gets interesting. The Vatican is technically a country, the smallest country in the world, but a country nonetheless. That status was formalized in 1929 with the Lateran Treaty, when Mussolini and Pope Pius XI finally ended the standoff that started in 1870. The Pope got to keep the Vatican as a sovereign state, and in exchange he recognized the Kingdom of Italy and agreed to stay out of Italian politics. As part of the deal, Italy paid the Vatican 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in Italian government bonds as compensation for the Papal States. In today's money, we're talking about something close to $100 million in immediate cash, a fortune in 1929. Now, having a fortune is one thing, protecting it and making it grow is another. The Vatican needed sophisticated financial management, and that meant getting into bed with Italian bankers who knew how to navigate both legal and, shall we say, creative financial channels. This is where the story starts getting murkier, because the line between legitimate banking and money laundering gets very thin very fast, especially when your institution operates outside the jurisdiction of every financial regulator on Earth. The Vatican Bank's structure made it uniquely suited for discretion. As a sovereign entity, it didn't have to report to Italian authorities or comply with Italian banking regulations. It didn't answer to the European Union because the Vatican isn't in the EU. It operated in euros and could conduct business across international borders, but it didn't have to follow the same disclosure requirements as every other bank in Europe. For decades, there were no audits, no external oversight, no requirement to report suspicious transactions. If you wanted to move money quietly, this was the Swiss bank account of religious institutions, except even more secretive than Switzerland, and people noticed. By the 1950s and 60s, the Vatican Bank wasn't just managing money for nuns and priests. It was handling accounts for wealthy Italian businessmen, politicians, and, here's where it gets problematic, individuals with connections to organized crime. The bank became a tool for capital flight, helping wealthy Italians circumvent Italian currency controls and tax laws. You'd deposit lire in Italy, the money would somehow end up in a Vatican bank account, and then it would reappear in Switzerland or the United States, cleaned and untraceable. The Vatican wasn't exactly advertising this service, but it wasn't stopping it either. By the 1970s, the Vatican Bank had become something its founders probably didn't envision, or maybe they did, and that's the disturbing part. It was a de facto offshore bank sitting in the middle of Rome, handling billions in assets with almost zero transparency. And it was about to become the center of one of the most spectacular financial scandals in modern history, featuring a banker named Roberto Calvi, who would end up dead under very mysterious circumstances, a secret Masonic lodge, the Sicilian Mafia, and allegations that would reach all the way to the desk of the Pope himself. Enter Roberto Calvi, a man who would eventually be called God's banker and whose death would become one of the most notorious unsolved murders in European history. Calvi started his career as a conventional banker at Banco Ambrosiano, a Milan-based Catholic bank founded in 1902. By 1975, he'd worked his way up to chairman. Banco Ambrosiano was already connected to the Vatican. Its very name came from Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan. But under Calvi's leadership, that connection became a full-blown partnership with the Vatican Bank. Here's how the scheme worked, at least as prosecutors and investigators later pieced it together. Calvi used the Vatican Bank to create a network of shell companies in offshore havens, the Bahamas, Panama, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. Banco Ambrosiano would loan money to these shell companies, which were nominally owned or controlled by the Vatican Bank. The shell companies would then make loans to other entities or invest in various ventures, many of which were questionable at best. The money would move through so many jurisdictions and corporate layers that tracing it became nearly impossible. On paper, Banco Ambrosiano's balance sheet looked fine. It had all these loans out, which counted as assets. The problem was that many of those loans would never be repaid because the borrowers were fake companies, empty shells with no actual business operations. The Vatican Bank's involvement provided cover. Banco Ambrosiano could tell its auditors and regulators that these loans were secured by relationships with the Holy See. Who's going to question a loan guaranteed by the Pope's bank? And the Vatican Bank, protected by sovereign immunity, didn't have to answer questions from Italian investigators. The sums involved were staggering. By the early 1980s, Banco Ambrosiano had loans outstanding worth over $1 billion to these ghost companies. And remember, this is early 80s dollars. So multiply that by about 3 for today's money. The bank was essentially insolvent, propped up by a web of fraudulent transactions and the Vatican's implicit backing. And Calvi wasn't just stealing money for himself, though he certainly enriched himself. Evidence suggests the money was flowing to multiple destinations: Solidarity movement in Poland, fighting the communists, which the Vatican supported; Italian political parties, both legal contributions and illegal bribes; organized crime figures, and various other players in Italy's murky underworld of politics and finance. Now you might be wondering, where were the regulators? Where were the auditors? Great questions. The answer is they were trying, but Calvi had protection. He was a member of Propaganda Due, known as P2, a secret Masonic lodge that included some of the most powerful men in Italy: military officers, intelligence officials, politicians, journalists, businessmen. P2 wasn't just a social club, it was essentially a shadow government with fascist sympathies, plotting to manipulate Italian politics and society. The lodge's grandmaster, Licio Gelli, had connections to everyone from the CIA to South American dictators to the Italian Mafia. When you're in P2, you've got friends in high places who can make problems disappear, at least for a while. And Calvi's most important connection? Archbishop Marcinkus, the American prelate who ran the Vatican Bank from 1971 to 1989. Marcinkus was a tough guy from Cicero, Illinois, the same Chicago suburb where Al Capone once operated. He'd risen through the Vatican ranks by serving as Pope Paul VI's bodyguard and fixer. He was the kind of priest who looked more comfortable in a linebacker's uniform than investments, and he ran the Vatican Bank like a personal fiefdom. Marcinkus and Calvi were partners, and their partnership turned the Vatican Bank into what Italian prosecutors would later describe as a criminal enterprise. By early 1982, the whole house of cards was starting to collapse. Italian banking regulators were finally starting to ask hard questions about Banco Ambrosiano's offshore loans. The Bank of Italy demanded documentation, explanations, proof that these loans were legitimate. Calvi couldn't provide it because there was nothing to provide, just empty shell companies and fraudulent accounting. Banco Ambrosiano's stock price was collapsing. Calvi was desperate. He needed the Vatican to either bail him out or at least publicly acknowledge their involvement in the offshore companies, which would buy him time. In May of 1982, Calvi wrote to Pope John Paul II, begging for help. He claimed he'd been working on behalf of the Vatican and the Church's political interests. He warned that if Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, the scandal would drag the Vatican down with it. The letter read like a threat and a plea at the same time. The Vatican's response was silence. Archbishop Marcinkus, suddenly realizing he might be criminally liable, started distancing himself from Calvi. The friendship was over. The protection was gone. Calvi was on his own. On June 10, 1982, Calvi fled Italy using a false passport. He traveled through Austria and eventually made it to London, staying in a small apartment in Chelsea. According to his family, he was terrified. He told his daughter that he feared for his life, that powerful people wanted him dead. He was carrying documents, briefcases full of evidence about the offshore schemes, about who had benefited from the fraud, about the Vatican's involvement. He claimed these documents would protect him, that they were his insurance policy. If anything happened to him, the documents would be released, and everyone would go down together. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a postal clerk walking across Blackfriars Bridge in London noticed something hanging beneath the bridge. It was Roberto Calvi, suspended from scaffolding under the bridge, a rope around his neck. His pockets were stuffed with bricks and stones, about 12 pounds worth. He had $15,000 in various currencies on him. The initial ruling was suicide. British investigators concluded that Calvi, facing financial ruin and criminal charges, had climbed down onto the scaffolding and hanged himself, weighing his pockets down for some reason that was never adequately explained. His family immediately cried murder, and honestly, the suicide theory made no sense. Calvi was 62 years old and overweight. The scaffolding was difficult to access even for a young, fit person. How did he get down there in the dark, tie a rope, stuff his pockets with bricks, and hang himself? And why would a man committing suicide bother to bring bricks? Why would he bring thousands in cash? The suicide explanation was nonsense, and most serious investigators knew it. This was a hit, a message. The question was, who ordered it? Theories multiplied. The Sicilian Mafia had motive. Calvi had laundered their money, and they wanted him silenced. P2 had motive. Calvi knew too much about Italy's shadow government. The Vatican had motive. Calvi could implicate the highest levels of the church hierarchy. Italian intelligence had motive. The scandal was embarrassing the government. So did the CIA. There were whispers that some of the money had funded covert operations. In 2005, after decades of investigations, Italian prosecutors charged 5 people with Calvi's murder, 4 Mafia figures, and a Rome businessman with P2 connections. All were eventually acquitted for lack of evidence, though the court acknowledged that Calvi had almost certainly been murdered. To this day, no one has been convicted. Tell me in the comments, do you think the Vatican ordered Calvi's murder, or was it the Mafia tying up loose ends? The evidence points in multiple directions, and honestly, it's possible multiple groups wanted him dead. Maybe they all got lucky on the same night. With Calvi dead and Banco Ambrosiano collapsing, the spotlight turned fully onto the Vatican Bank and Archbishop Marcinkus. Italian prosecutors wanted to question Marcinkus, to search Vatican Bank records, to follow the money trail. There was just one problem. Marcinkus was inside Vatican City, protected by sovereign immunity. Italian authorities couldn't touch him. They issued arrest warrants. But the Vatican refused to hand him over. Pope John Paul II, whatever he knew or didn't know, was protecting his banker. The Vatican's official position was denial. They claimed Marcinkus had done nothing wrong, that the Vatican Bank had merely provided some administrative services to Banco Ambrosiano, but wasn't responsible for Calvi's fraud. They produced letters suggesting that the relationship was at arm's length, that they'd been deceived just like everyone else. But Italian prosecutors weren't buying it. They had evidence of direct involvement, documents showing the Vatican Bank controlled those offshore shell companies, internal Vatican memos discussing the arrangements, transfer records showing money flowing in and out. The political pressure was immense. The Italian government demanded answers. The scandal was dominating headlines across Europe. Banco Ambrosiano's collapse had cost depositors and investors over $1 billion. The Vatican's reputation was in free fall. Finally, in May of 1984, the Vatican agreed to a settlement. Without admitting guilt, the Holy See paid $244 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors as a goodwill contribution. That's roughly $600 million in today's money, just handed over to make the scandal go away. You don't pay $600 million out of goodwill unless you're trying to avoid something much worse. Marcinkus remained in the Vatican, effectively under house arrest in the world's smallest country. He couldn't leave Vatican territory without risking arrest by Italian authorities, so he stayed put. He was never tried, never convicted, never even officially questioned by Italian prosecutors. He continued running the Vatican Bank until 1989, when he was finally reassigned to a parish in Arizona, where he lived quietly until his death in 2006. To the end, he insisted he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been serving the church's interests, that the scandal was overblown. In a 1986 interview, he famously said, "You can't run the church on Hail Marys. It was supposed to be a defense. We live in the real world. Sometimes you have to make tough choices, but it came across as a confession. Yeah, we played dirty, because that's how the game works. What happened to all that money? Where did the $1 billion+ really go? The full truth has never been revealed. Some money definitely went to solidarity in Poland. The Vatican was supporting the anti-communist resistance, and funneling money through secret channels was necessary to avoid Soviet interference. Some money went to Italian politicians as bribes or illegal campaign contributions. Some went to the Mafia, either as payment for services or as money laundering for their drug proceeds. Some was stolen outright by Calvi, Marcinkus, and their associates, and some probably sits in accounts that no one has found yet, hidden behind decades-old shell companies in jurisdictions that don't ask questions. The Calvi affair should have been a wake-up call. It should have forced the Vatican to reform the bank, to implement transparency, to submit to external oversight. And to Pope John Paul II's credit, he tried. He appointed reformers, brought in external auditors, issued statements about the need for financial integrity. But institutional change is hard, especially when the institution in question has operated in secrecy for decades and when powerful people inside the Vatican benefit from that secrecy. The reforms were superficial. The Vatican Bank continued to operate with minimal oversight, and within a decade, it was caught up in new scandals. The 1990s and 2000s brought a parade of smaller controversies, accounts linked to drug cartels, money from the Sicilian Mafia, and suspicious transactions that kept popping up in investigations across Italy. But the Vatican Bank stayed largely out of the headlines until 2010. When a perfect storm of scandals reignited public scrutiny. This time, it wasn't just Italian prosecutors paying attention. It was the entire European Union, international anti-money laundering authorities, and even the United States government. In September of 2010, Italian financial police seized 23 million euros from a Vatican Bank account at an Italian bank. The Vatican Bank had been trying to transfer the money, but couldn't provide adequate documentation about its origin or purpose. Under anti-money laundering laws, that's a red flag. The seizure was humiliating, a major news story suggesting the Vatican Bank was still involved in shady finance. The Vatican protested, claimed it was a misunderstanding, eventually got the money back after providing documentation, but the damage was done. International financial regulators started treating the Vatican like a potential money laundering risk. Around the same time, journalists published leaked documents revealing internal Vatican Bank communications. The documents showed bank officials discussing how to avoid Italian regulations, how to structure transactions to minimize scrutiny, and how to maintain relationships with clients whose money might be questionable. One memo literally discussed ways to help clients avoid oversight. This wasn't ancient history from the Marcinkus era. These were contemporary documents, showing that the culture of secrecy and regulatory evasion was alive and well. Pope Benedict XVI, who'd become Pope in 2005, was a scholar, a theologian, not a manager. He was temperamentally ill-suited for the kind of tough, hands-on reform the Vatican Bank needed, but he recognized the problem was spiraling out of control. In 2012, he appointed a German lawyer, Ernst von Freiberg, to head the bank with a mandate to clean house. Von Freiberg found a mess. He later said the bank's record-keeping was medieval, that accounts were opened with minimal documentation, that no one had been tracking whether clients were using the bank for legitimate purposes or money laundering. It was a scandal waiting to happen, over and over again. Benedict also created the Financial Information Authority, a Vatican agency tasked with monitoring financial transactions for money laundering and terrorist financing. It was the Vatican's first real attempt at regulatory oversight. But implementing these reforms meant confronting entrenched interests inside the Vatican, cardinals and officials who'd benefited from the old system, who had their own accounts or were protecting friends and allies who did. The resistance was fierce. Benedict, aging and increasingly overwhelmed by the dysfunction around him, made the shocking decision to resign in 2013, the first pope to resign in nearly 600 years. While he cited health reasons, people close to the Vatican say the financial scandals and his inability to reform the system were major factors in his decision. Enter Pope Francis. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Argentinian Jesuit who'd spent his career working with the poor, was an odd choice to reform a corrupt bank. He wasn't a financial expert. He'd never run a major institution. But he had something his predecessors lacked: political courage and a willingness to burn bridges. Francis made it clear from day one that cleaning up Vatican finances was a top priority. He kept von Freiberg on, strengthened the Financial Information Authority, invited external audits from international firms, and started closing accounts that couldn't be justified. The reforms were real. Between 2013 and 2015, the Vatican Bank closed thousands of accounts, estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000, belonging to people who had no legitimate connection to the Catholic Church. Politicians, businessmen, diplomats who'd been using Vatican Bank accounts for tax evasion or money laundering suddenly found their accounts shuttered. The bank started complying with international anti-money laundering standards, joining global information sharing agreements that the Vatican had resisted for decades. For the first time, the Vatican Bank submitted to external audits and published financial statements. The days of total opacity were over, or so it seemed. But here's the thing about institutional reform. It's always incomplete. It's always resisted, and it's always vulnerable to backsliding. Even as Francis pushed transparency, scandals kept emerging. In 2017, the Vatican Bank's former chief accountant was arrested and later convicted of embezzling millions. In 2019, Vatican police raided the offices of the Secretariat of State, effectively the Vatican's foreign ministry, and seized documents related to suspicious real estate investments. The investigation revealed that the Secretariat of State, which operates its own financial office separate from the Vatican Bank, had been using church funds to speculate in luxury London real estate, losing hundreds of millions in the process. That scandal, which became known as the London Building Affair, exposed a fundamental problem. Francis had reformed the Vatican Bank, but money was still flowing through other Vatican departments with minimal oversight. The Secretariat of State had been using a Swiss-Italian financier named Raffaele Mincioni to invest in a luxury development in Chelsea. The investment went sour. Mincioni allegedly pocketed massive fees, and the Vatican was left holding the bag. To exit the investment, Vatican officials then turned to another financier, Gianluigi Torzi, who allegedly extorted the Vatican for millions as the price of transferring ownership. It was a mess, and it revealed that even with a reform-minded pope, the Vatican's financial culture remained dysfunctional. In 2021, a Vatican trial began for 10 defendants, including Cardinal Angelo Becciu, a high-ranking prelate and one of Francis's own appointees, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of office. The trial has stretched on for years, featuring allegations of money laundering, bribes to witnesses, and misuse of donations meant for the poor. It's unprecedented, a cardinal on trial in Vatican City for financial crimes. The proceedings have been chaotic, allegations flying in all directions, and the outcome remains uncertain as of this recording. So where does that leave us? Where is Rome's gold, and who's watching it? The Vatican Bank, the Institute for the Works of Religion, still exists. It operates much more transparently than it did in Marcinkus's day. It publishes annual reports showing assets of roughly 5 to 6 billion euros. It's been accepted into international financial networks. It complies with anti-money laundering standards, and it operates under regulatory oversight that didn't exist a decade ago. By modern banking standards, it's reasonably clean, or at least as clean as any major financial institution. But the question in our title, "Where does Rome hide its gold?" isn't just about the Vatican Bank. The Vatican's wealth is spread across multiple institutions and entities, many of which still operate with limited transparency. There's the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, which manages the Vatican's real estate and financial holdings. There's the Secretariat for the Economy, created by Francis to oversee all Vatican finances. There are the various curial departments that operate their own accounts and investments. There are priceless art collections, ancient manuscripts, and vast real estate portfolios across the world. Estimating the Catholic Church's total wealth is nearly impossible because so much of it is held in forms that don't appear on any balance sheet. Some experts estimate the Vatican's liquid assets, money it can actually spend, at somewhere between $10 and $15 billion. But that doesn't include the value of St. Peter's Basilica, the Sistine Chapel, or the thousands of churches and properties the Vatican owns globally. If you tried to put a price tag on all of it, you'd be talking about hundreds of billions, possibly over $1 trillion. But much of that wealth can't be liquidated. You can't sell the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's wealth. But it's also heritage, history, identity. The Church isn't a corporation that can be liquidated for shareholder value. And this gets to the deeper question our title implies. Why does the Vatican need all this money? What is it for? The official answer is that it funds the Church's global mission, supporting parishes in poor countries, running schools and hospitals, maintaining diplomatic relations, funding charitable works, paying the salaries of Vatican employees and clergy worldwide. And much of that is true. The Vatican does fund significant charitable work. Catholic organizations run hospitals, schools, and social services across the developing world. Papal charities distribute tens of millions annually to disaster relief and humanitarian causes. But there's also a darker answer, one the Church doesn't like to acknowledge. Institutional wealth becomes an end in itself. Once you have billions, you need financial experts to manage it. Those experts bring their own priorities and values, which aren't always aligned with the gospel. You start making investment decisions based on return rates rather than ethical considerations. You end up holding stock in pharmaceutical companies, weapons manufacturers, fossil fuel companies, entities whose activities might conflict with Church teachings but whose dividends keep the institution solvent. The Vatican has been criticized for years over its investment portfolio. In 2019, investigative journalists revealed that Vatican money was invested in films that the Church's own rating system had condemned as morally objectionable, including movies with extreme violence and sexual content. The Vatican owned shares in companies through managed funds, and those fund managers weren't checking whether the investments aligned with Catholic values. They were just chasing returns. When confronted, Vatican officials seemed genuinely surprised, which tells you how disconnected the financial operations had become from the religious mission. There's also the question of what the Vatican chooses not to do with its wealth. The Church sits on billions, while many Catholic parishes in poor countries operate on shoestring budgets, while Catholic schools close for lack of funds, while priests in developing nations live in poverty. Francis has pushed for greater financial support to the periphery, but the institutional resistance is strong. Cardinals and bishops who run wealthy dioceses or Vatican departments aren't eager to redistribute wealth to poorer regions. The Vatican operates like any other hierarchical institution. Those at the top protect their resources and prerogatives, even if that means the mission suffers. And then there's the abuse crisis. The Catholic Church has paid out billions. Yes, billions with a B, in settlements to victims of clergy sexual abuse. In the United States alone, dioceses have paid over $4 billion in settlements, therapy costs, and legal fees. Multiple dioceses have declared bankruptcy because of abuse-related claims. And where does that money come from? From the same pool of resources that's supposed to fund the church's mission. In effect, the institutional church's financial sins and its moral sins have become intertwined. Money that should have gone to charity or ministry instead goes to cover up decades of criminal abuse and to pay victims for suffering that should never have occurred. Pope Francis has tried to address this. He's pushed for greater transparency, for financial reforms, for a culture of accountability. But he's one man at the top of a 2,000-year-old institution with layers of bureaucracy, entrenched interests, and a culture of secrecy that runs deep. Every time he makes progress, resistance emerges. Cardinals push back, anonymous leaks to the press try to undermine reforms, and the machinery of institutional self-preservation kicks in. Francis has made more progress than any pope in modern history, but the fundamental problems remain. Too much money, too little oversight, and a culture that still values institutional preservation over transparency and justice. So, to return to our title question, where does Rome hide its gold? The answer is, it doesn't hide it as well as it used to, but it's still not telling the whole truth. The Vatican Bank is cleaner than it was in the Marcinkus era, but it's not fully transparent. Vatican finances are more regulated than they were a decade ago, but loopholes remain. The Church's global wealth is partially documented, but huge portions remain opaque. And the culture that allowed Roberto Calvi to launder mob money through Vatican accounts, that protected Archbishop Marcinkus from prosecution, that tolerated decades of financial mismanagement, that culture hasn't been fully rooted out. It's been pruned back, put on a shorter leash, but it's still there. Let's talk about what this all means. Because the Vatican Bank story isn't just about one corrupt institution, it's a case study in how any powerful organization can lose its way when it prioritizes secrecy over accountability. The Vatican Bank's defenders will tell you that the Church needed financial sophistication to operate in the modern world, that maintaining some privacy was necessary to protect donors and conduct sensitive diplomatic work, that the scandals were aberrations committed by a few bad actors. And there's some truth to each of those claims, but they don't excuse what happened. The core problem was always this: the Vatican claimed moral authority while operating a financial system that enabled criminal activity. You can't preach the gospel on Sunday and then run a money laundering operation on Monday. You can't lecture the world about justice and transparency while hiding behind sovereign immunity to avoid answering for fraud. And you can't claim to be the moral voice of humanity while paying hundreds of millions in hush money to make scandals disappear. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and people noticed. What's remarkable is how long the Vatican got away with it. For decades, the combination of religious deference and sovereign immunity created a shield that protected the Vatican from the kind of scrutiny any other financial institution would face. Italian prosecutors who tried to investigate ran into walls. International regulators had no jurisdiction. Journalists who dug too deep found sources drying up or, in a few cases, facing threats. The Vatican used its diplomatic status, its moral prestige, and its network of allies to deflect accountability. It took multiple massive scandals, dead bodies, and finally the embarrassment of being shut out of international banking networks to force real change. The Roberto Calvi case remains the most dramatic example. A banker with deep ties to the Vatican Bank ends up hanging under a bridge in London, his pockets stuffed with bricks, and no one is ever convicted of his murder. The Italian courts concluded it was murder, not suicide. Multiple investigations pointed to a conspiracy involving the Mafia, P2, and possibly Vatican figures. But the evidence was circumstantial. Witnesses disappeared or recanted, and the prosecution couldn't make the case stick. It's entirely possible, even likely, that powerful people got away with murder because Calvi knew too much and threatened to talk. Think about what that means. The Vatican Bank's involvement in fraud was so deep the secrets it was protecting so damaging that someone decided Calvi had to die. And whether the Vatican ordered the hit, knew about it in advance, or simply breathed a sigh of relief when it happened, the institution benefited from his silence. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's the conclusion of multiple serious investigations, and no one at the Vatican has ever faced consequences. Marcinkus died in Arizona. Comfortable and unrepentant, the cardinals and bishops who knew what was happening kept their positions. The system protected its own. But let's also acknowledge the reformers. Pope John Paul II, despite his flaws and his protection of Marcinkus, did eventually take steps to improve oversight. Benedict XVI, even though he failed to complete the job, recognized the problem and tried. And Francis has pushed harder than any pope in living memory to drag Vatican finances into the 21st century. The creation of the Financial Information Authority, the external audits, the closing of thousands of accounts, the prosecution of Cardinal Becciu. These aren't small things. They represent a genuine attempt to break with the past. The question is whether it's enough. The Vatican Bank today is a much cleaner operation than it was in 1982 or even in 2010. But clean compared to the Marcinkus era is a pretty low bar. And the London building scandal, the embezzlement by the chief accountant, the ongoing trial of a cardinal, these suggest that financial dysfunction at the Vatican runs deeper than just one bank. It's a cultural problem, an institutional problem, embedded in how the Vatican views money, power, and accountability. Here's something most people don't think about. The Vatican Bank scandal is also a story about what happens when institutions prioritize survival over mission. The Catholic Church's core mission, at least in theory, is spreading the gospel, caring for the poor, and serving as a moral witness to the world. Money is supposed to be a tool to accomplish that mission. But somewhere along the way, the tool became the mission. Protecting the institution's wealth and reputation became more important than living up to its values. This isn't unique to the Catholic Church. You see it in universities that build massive endowments while adjunct professors live in poverty. You see it in charities that spend more on fundraising and executive salaries than on actual charitable work. You see it in corporations that claim to value their workers but fight tooth and nail against unions and fair wages. And you see it in governments that talk about public service while politicians funnel money to cronies and donors. Once institutions accumulate wealth and power, they develop a vested interest in protecting that wealth and power, even at the expense of their stated mission. The Vatican Bank became a perfect example of this dynamic. It started as a practical solution to a real problem, how to manage the church's finances in a hostile environment. But it evolved into something that served institutional interests at the expense of institutional integrity. And once that happened, once the bank became a tool for money laundering and tax evasion, once it developed relationships with criminals and corrupt politicians, reforming it meant admitting that the institution had failed, that it had betrayed its mission. That's a very hard admission for any institution to make, especially one that claims to speak with moral authority. What would genuine reform look like? Full transparency, for one. Publishing detailed financial statements for all Vatican departments, not just the bank. Real external oversight, with international auditors having full access to accounts and transactions. Clear ethical guidelines for investments, ensuring that Vatican money isn't funding companies whose activities contradict church teaching. And most importantly, a cultural shift that treats financial misconduct as a moral failing, not just a legal problem. Priests and bishops who abuse their financial positions should face the same consequences as those who commit other forms of abuse. Removal from ministry, public accountability, prosecution where warranted. Has Francis achieved this? Not yet. He's made progress, but the resistance is fierce. Every reform attempt faces pushback from Vatican insiders who benefit from the old system. Anonymous leaks to the Italian press try to undermine reform efforts. Conservative cardinals accuse Francis of overreach and mismanagement, and the Vatican's bureaucratic culture, developed over centuries, is designed to outlast any individual pope. Francis is 88 years old as of this recording. His papacy won't last forever. The question is whether the reforms will stick after he's gone or whether the next pope will face pressure to roll them back. There's also a generational divide. Older clergy, formed in the pre-scandal era, often don't see financial secrecy as a problem. It's just how things were always done. Younger clergy, especially those who came of age during the abuse crisis and financial scandals, are often more reform-minded. They've seen the damage that secrecy and institutional self-protection can cause. But the Catholic Church is a gerontocracy. Power rests with old men. Francis himself is a reformer, but he's also 88. The next generation of leaders will determine whether his reforms become permanent or whether the institution slides back into old habits. Let's zoom out for a minute and think about what we've learned. The Vatican Bank story teaches us several uncomfortable truths about power, institutions, and human nature. First, secrecy enables corruption. When institutions operate without oversight, without external accountability, bad actors will exploit that secrecy for personal gain. It doesn't matter if the institution is a bank, a government agency, a corporation, or a church, the dynamic is the same. Second, institutional loyalty often trumps moral duty. The Vatican protected Marcinkus not because Vatican officials thought he was innocent, but because prosecuting him would have damaged the institution. They prioritized the church's reputation over justice. This happens everywhere. Police departments that protect bad cops, corporations that cover up executive misconduct, political parties that excuse ethical violations by their own members. Institutional loyalty is a powerful force, and it often overrides individual conscience. Third, reform is always resisted. When Francis started closing accounts and imposing transparency measures, he faced fierce opposition from Vatican insiders. Why? Because reform threatens entrenched interests, it exposes past wrongdoing, and it limits future opportunities for those who benefited from the old system. Every reform movement in every institution faces this resistance. The difference is whether leadership has the courage and power to push through it. Fourth, accountability is rare for powerful institutions. Despite decades of scandals, despite multiple investigations, despite overwhelming evidence of financial crimes, almost no one at the Vatican has faced serious consequences. Marcinkus escaped prosecution. Most of the cardinals and bishops who enabled or participated in the schemes kept their positions. The institution paid fines and settlements, but individuals were protected. This is the norm, not the exception. Powerful institutions rarely hold their own leaders accountable unless external pressure makes it unavoidable. And fifth, moral authority is fragile. The Catholic Church's claim to moral leadership has been severely damaged by these scandals. When you preach about justice and honesty and then get caught running a corrupt bank, people notice the hypocrisy. Rebuilding that moral authority requires not just stopping the corrupt practices, but publicly acknowledging them, apologizing for them, and demonstrating through actions that the institution has changed. The Vatican has been reluctant to do this. There's been no public apology for the Marcinkus era, no official acknowledgement of how deeply the corruption ran. Without that reckoning, the moral authority remains compromised. So where does this leave the average Catholic? For many, these scandals have been devastating. They've watched their church, which preaches poverty and humility, revealed as a financial empire that played by different rules. They've seen leaders who should have been shepherds acting like corporate executives protecting their bonuses. And they've had to reconcile their faith with an institution that seems to have lost its way. Some have left the church over it, others have stayed but become more critical, more demanding of accountability. And still others have separated their faith from the institution, deciding that their relationship with God doesn't depend on whether the Vatican Bank is clean. For non-Catholics watching from the outside, the Vatican Bank scandals are a reminder that no institution deserves blind trust. Religious organizations, because they claim moral authority, sometimes get a pass on scrutiny that we'd apply to any other institution. The assumption is that people motivated by faith will behave better than those motivated by profit. The Vatican Bank story proves that assumption wrong. Clergy and church officials are humans, subject to the same temptations and moral failures as everyone else. Putting them on a pedestal, assuming they're above corruption, just makes it easier for them to get away with it. So, final answer. Where does Rome hide its gold? In plain sight, mostly. The Vatican Bank sits at Via della Conciliazione, right near St. Peter's Square. You can walk past it. It's not hidden in secret vaults or buried in catacombs. It's in financial accounts, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, art collections, and the balance sheets of Vatican departments. The hiding isn't about physical location. It's about opacity, complexity, and leveraging sovereign immunity to avoid the scrutiny that every other financial institution faces. The gold, the church's wealth, comes from centuries of donations, investments, real estate, and yes, sometimes fraud and money laundering. It's been used for both noble and ignoble purposes, funding charitable works and diplomatic missions, but also enriching corrupt officials, protecting criminals, and covering up institutional failures. The story of Vatican finances is a very human story about how good intentions can be corrupted, how institutions can lose their way, and how hard it is to hold powerful entities accountable. The Roberto Calvi affair remains the darkest chapter, a reminder that when institutions prioritize secrecy over transparency, people can die and no one is held accountable. Calvi's murder under Blackfriars Bridge is unsolved, but everyone involved knew what happened. The Mafia, P2, possibly Vatican officials. Someone decided he knew too much and had to be silenced. And the institutions he served, the ones that benefited from his silence, moved on without consequence. That's the real scandal, not just the financial crimes, but the impunity. Francis's reforms are real, but incomplete. The Vatican Bank is cleaner, but Vatican finances as a whole remain too opaque. The culture of secrecy has been challenged, but not dismantled. And the fundamental question remains, can an institution that claims to represent divine truth operate with worldly opacity? Can the Church maintain its moral authority while protecting financial secrets? The tension between the sacred and the profane, between spiritual mission and institutional survival, runs through this entire story. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about history that doesn't pull punches and institutions being held accountable. There's more where this came from, stories about power, money, and the messy reality behind the myths we tell ourselves. Subscribe if you want more of this. Drop a comment with your take on whether the Vatican can ever fully clean up its act, and check out the other videos on the channel for deep dives into the parts of history that don't make it into the textbooks. The Vatican Bank will never be fully transparent. Sovereign immunity and the Church's nature as a global institution make that impossible. But the pressure for accountability is real now in a way it wasn't in Marcinkus's time. The days of operating with complete impunity are over. Whether that's enough, whether the reforms will last, whether the next scandal is just around the corner, that remains to be seen. The history of Vatican finances suggests optimism is premature, but maybe, just maybe, this time is different. We'll see. History isn't finished with this story yet.